Book Stew viewers and listeners, once again, you see the backdrop of my home office because our studio is still being renovated. But it doesn't matter to me where I speak to Lamar Giles at. It's always such a pleasure. And it's the 7th time Lamar has appeared as my guest, which is the all-time record. And I think will continue to be the all-time record because Lamar is so prolific and he's got so much going on between YA novels and horror and comics. So Lamar, welcome back to Book Stew.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And today we're going to be talking about your new book, which is called Ruin Road. It comes out, actually, I think on my birthday, September 17th.
I didn't know that. Well, happy early birthday. I'll try to touch base with you on that day to say hello.
Sounds good, and happy publishing date. So, you had given hints at our last episode about this book. I think there's kind of a fundamental difference in this book than there were in your others, in that this deals with the supernatural. And there are also there's kind of a bleed in from comic books too, which I thought was interesting. So the first thing I'm going to ask you about is the comic book character Blade, since he appears in the book and he's kind of the opposite of Batman. So I think we're all pretty familiar with Batman, but can you talk about the Batman versus Blade controversy that was in the book?
Well, first of all, you know that I'm a long-time comic book fan, so these characters are all very familiar to me. And it's just a running debate between the main character, Cade, and his best friend, Book, about which character is better. They have a favorite. I believe Book is a Batman fan, while Cade is a Blade fan. And the big difference they argue about is how they handle villains, where Batman is constantly having to capture the same villains over and over again because he refuses to kill them, where Blade is a monster hunter who puts monsters down immediately. And it's a theme that will come back into play in the book. I won't give too much away, but it's a fundamental character exploration between those two friends.
All right, let's talk about Cade, since I should have introduced him first. Cade is a high school football player in his senior year, and one of the fascinating parts and a big part of the book is that Cade goes to one of these kind of football factory schools, which, they are there for outstanding athletes in primarily, I'd say, in basketball and football. And but it almost sounds like this school is a combination of that and the academies that came up when integration came about. These were like all white academies that parents put together or churches put together so that they could save their white children from going to school with Black children. I thought the academy itself was almost like a character because Cade does run into difficulties. He's one of the few Black students in the school. He's universally admired for his athletic skills, but somehow he doesn't fit in, especially compared to his neighborhood. So do you want to talk a little bit about Cade as the character and his school situation?
Sure. Should I tell a little bit about the main premise of the book? And then, so the main premise of Ruin Road is Cade, as you said, he doesn't fit in necessarily white spaces. He's very comfortable in his neighborhood, and because he's a large Black boy, when he's not in his neighborhood, people tend to fear him for no reason at all, other than perpetuated racism. And there's a point in the book where Cade makes a wish that people stop being afraid of him. That wish comes true, but everyone he meets from that point forward loses their fear of everything, which causes chaos. And in terms of his school, Neeson Preparatory, and I would say any reader who reads, pay attention to the names of people and places in this book. Neeson Preparatory is a place where there are few Black students, and they're mainly valued for abilities that racist people tend to value in Black people: athletic ability, entertainment ability. And that's just not a space that's comfortable when Cade is capable of so much more. He understands football as an avenue to help his family. But throughout the book, you see that he's just a good kid who can use many of his skills to help people.
So the wish is also a really main concept in the book. I'm always nervous about giving too much away, but his wish is basically, he wasn't like presented with a genie and a lamp and three wishes or anything. He basically ends up, because of fleeing from a bad situation on public transportation where a white woman was accusing him of trying to steal her pocketbook or whatever, he ends up in a pawn shop. And when he's in the pawn shop, he just, as an aside, thinking about what he had just been through because he had to run to escape from police who would have bothered him about this woman's claim that was not true, that he was trying to steal her pocketbook. He ends up in this pawn shop and he just kind of speaks off the cuff and said, I wish that people weren't afraid of me, kind of because of the way I present. And then everything happens as a result of that. If he had not made that kind of off the cuff wish, you wouldn't have a plot, basically. So how did you, when you were thinking about this book, how did, how did you put the pieces together? I'm going to ask you that because there's a lot going on in the book that we haven't even talked about yet, especially the supernatural part. But where was the germ of the idea on this one?
Well, every book I write, a challenge I set for myself is to never explicitly state what I'm really writing about. And so that's where a lot of the supernatural stuff in this book comes from, because Cade's Wish is really more of an analogy for how difficult it is for these kids who are these superstar athletes to make it to that pro level. Not just a matter of competition, but how any little misstep in life can derail their ambition and opportunity. It's like always this thing I used to hear when I was growing up, and Michael Jordan was the best basketball player on the planet. People would say there are people who were better than Michael Jordan who never made it because of XYZ. Something bad happened where they lost their life, or they made a bad choice and ended up in a prison situation when they could have been out there being the NBA superstar, the NFL superstar. So the supernatural in this book is a manifestation of that, like how hard it is for kids to beat those lottery odds to make it to that level.
And there's a very tight relationship between Cade and his friends Book and Gabby. So Cade has a wonderful family. His father was an attorney who fought for the rights of the people who live in their neighborhood, and is now stricken with lung cancer and is not doing well. He's got a great mom and a great sister, but then he has these two friends, Book and Gabby, and they are kind of his, I don't know how, they're his family. They're part of his family, even though they're not blood related. And each of them kind of also are depending on, well, he wants to bring them with him. If he can succeed and go to the NFL, he feels like, I got you guys. If you just kind of stay out of trouble, when I get to the NFL, you'll be with me. You'll be the people with me. I will help you. I will do anything to help you. But neither of them feel 100% confident that that's going to happen. And B, I think they kind of want to also want to make their own way. How did you come up with the idea of like a family that's not exactly your family?
Well, I think in any neighborhood, if you're there long enough, you start to bond with the people around you. At least that's the way it felt when I was growing up. And in particular, Jacob's Court, what I wanted to present was a Black neighborhood that had a lot of different types of families that were tight. Because sometimes when I see depictions of Black neighborhoods in TV and film, it's always like everybody's the same and everybody has the same problems to deal with. When in reality, it's like any other neighborhood. It's a variety of households and families and connections. So I wanted to show that in Jacob's Court. And then in the case with Book and Gabby, because they have a different family dynamic than what Cade has, I wanted to show that there's a bit of resiliency in everyone. Everyone wants to succeed in their own way and not just ride someone's coattails, because that tends to be the narrative when you see like the superstar athlete in TV and films. Like everybody's just trying to wait for them to make it and they can ride their coattails to fame and fortune. Where it's like, hey, that's great if Cade makes it and wants to help, but we're capable too.
I thought they were great characters. And I'm going to read one paragraph about the origins of Jacob's Court, because as a neighborhood, Jacob's Court has issues, but there's a main reason that that Jacob's Court came to be, and it was through kind of evil machination. So I'm just going to read one paragraph. Jacob slipped an arm over Arvin's shoulder. The materials we're using to build here cost 60% of what I'd use in higher quality buildings. I've had our architect reduce unit sizes by a barely noticeable 5% so we can squeeze more families in. We'll provide nominal maintenance on a fiscally opportune schedule. Our gains will be enormous while they suffer the indignities that, frankly, they're already accustomed to, he chuckled. At least they'll all be together under one roof. That cynical take, I think, is probably the basis of many buildings that people across this country live in that are substandard, based on the materials used and the lack of care put into them, and the interest in confining people to certain areas and restricting them from living wherever they want to. So I thought that was, even though there's kind of a supernatural part to this, it's something that we are aware of, and with redlining that happened all the time. So the supernatural part I want to speak a little bit about, because I actually did some research on it. So there is a supernatural villain who's called Zazzle in the book. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit. I looked up Zazzle because I had never heard that name before. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I found out, and then you can tell me if you knew all this when you invented Zazzle. So Zazzle is, there's two kind of religious cults that Zazzle appears in. One is a spirit associated with Saturn in occultism, or Azazel, an evil spirit who receives a scapegoat carrying the sins of the Jewish people during Yom Kippur, which is the New Year. Then there's an Azrael, who is God's angel of death, with a sword and a knife. Azrael tracks every living human being. So I don't know if that has anything to do with your Zazzle, but I was fascinated to find that out.
No, what you have just revealed to me is I really need to look up stuff that I think I'm making up, because the only reason Zazzle's name is what it is because I thought two Z's in a word made it sound weird. And that's all it was. And so it's actually amazing to know that there is lore out there for that name, because oftentimes when I'm naming stuff, it's more about the sound when I read it aloud. And I wanted it to sound a little off. And I felt like two Z's in somebody's name felt a little bit off. So that's fascinating. No, I didn't know any of that when I made it up.
All right, well, I Wikipedia'd and I fell in down that rabbit hole, so I bet you will too. So I'm glad I could turn you on to the real Azrael, who was kind of a villain. So let's talk a little bit about Ruin Road, the title, because there are some dramatic. Ruin Road is, as your characters describe it, is kind of the space between being awake and sleeping, between earth and everything that's not of the earth, maybe between heaven and hell. So I'm going to talk about how one character describes Ruin Road. Eddie is a really, I would say he was my favorite character in the book. Eddie is kind of a helpmate to Cade, but he himself is bound to Zazzle and his minions in the same way that Cade becomes. So Cade says, "What is this? How did I get here? Ruin Road got you here." Eddie's face scrunched. "When you're asleep and dreaming, you're on the road between realms. Souls travel this path, temporarily or permanently. Your best dreams are you skirting against a paradise, heaven for lack of a better word. Your nightmares, that's brushing against a worse place. Then there's all kinds of stuff in between. That's when you get into your super weird dreams. The pawn shop is located at an intersection. You and me are taking advantage of a rest stop right now. But why Ruin Road?" Eddie shrugged. "Most people are only going one way." So what came first? Did Cade come first? Did the idea of Ruin Road as a geographical kind of mental, spiritual, but seemingly real location, how did that come to you?
Well, it's Ruin Road is actually a thought I've had for a long time when either reading supernatural stuff or thinking of the sort of stories I might tell. And it's sort of my interpretation of what a lot of world religions probably are, which is the perception of whoever authored the religious text trying to understand the universe. And my perspective on that is we as living beings probably can never have a clear grasp of the entire universe, whether there is or is not an afterlife, what all that means as we go through our day to day. And so we're all trying to make sense of it. And I felt like the metaphor of a road between realms is apt, particularly in modern times. And that's just the concept I've wrestled with and tried to manifest in stories that have been smaller than Ruin Road. Eddie is not a new character, for example. I first wrote Eddie and the Pawn Shop almost 20 years ago in a short story called Wilson's Pawn and Loan. And this is me trying to revisit those concepts and wrestle with them as I get older, as I look at my daughter growing. Um, it's just a way to get into the idea of religion without necessarily leaning towards one specific religion or disrespecting a specific religion.
So that pathway into the supernatural and again, I'm stuck because I can't reveal really great plot points. Is that something you think you will continue to pursue in novels, or is this like a one shot? Because it seems like there's been a progression
Mhm.
um, to there. And maybe it ended up being because you dug up a short story that you liked and you didn't feel like you were quite finished with it. But what do you think your progression will be after Ruin Road? Because it is a little bit of a different twist.
I mean, I would love to write more stories that border the road, to put it that way. I agree with you. I think there has been a progression. Like, if I'm being honest, there's probably locales in the other stories and other books that would fit as intersections on the road, specifically like um Monty Fishto's, the fast food restaurant that pops up in a lot of my books. I've alluded to that being having some sort of supernatural elements to it, and I think it'd be fun to explore, particularly the idea that there are other worlds that border the road similar to ours. I think it'd be a good avenue, similar to Stephen King's Dark Tower. Um, and I'm always down to revisit that stuff. It just depends. I'm always busy. I'm always working on the next thing. I'd love to get back there eventually.
So speaking about the next thing, let's just go back to what's been going on with you. The last time we talked, Don Cheadle had optioned your previous novel. Is what's going on with that? Anything?
They just did a press release announcing that they have a couple of really great writers on board to try to write the pilot script. These writers worked on Westworld, HBO's long
Wow.
science fiction show, and so it's a really good team they have working on it. And so there's a little bit of momentum. That's good news, and I still have fingers crossed. Hollywood's a tough place, but we got some interesting things going. And with that team involved, I feel like we have a good shot at getting to the next thing, which would be maybe a green light on a pilot. So putting that energy out there, I would love to see the getaway manifest on somebody's screen.
It really, I think it was kind of a step up in attention for your writing, don't you think? Like in
Definitely, definitely. I think most of the books have done pretty well, but with the getaway, I think the change in direction of being dystopian, particularly the way things have been going in the world, a lot of people are writing scary stuff right now because the world feels scary, and I think a lot of eyes were on it. So, like I said, with that much attention, I'm going to remain hopeful that the TV show works out.
Are you still looking at doing comic books too?
I would love to. I have found that's a very tough avenue to go down. Like I did the graphic novel for DC Comics, and I ended up doing a short story for one of their Black History Month issues. But it's just hard to get repeat work in that industry. And the sort of stuff I want to do more long form. I'd probably have to do it independently, which means I have to find an artist, either work out some sort of ownership deal with them, which I'd be happy to do, or pay them up front. And that's very expensive. And it just becomes a logistical thing at this point because I have so many other projects happening.
So give us, are you allowed to tell us about some of the other projects that are going on?
One I can't talk about is I'll say this, it's for a company that anybody here would recognize.
All right.
And there are a bunch of clues behind me if you care to freeze frame and look. But the project I can talk a little bit about after that one is I'm going to do another thriller. So we've done the dystopian horror, we've done the supernatural horror, Ruin Road. I'm going to step backwards into a genre I've worked in for the most part my entire career and do another YA thriller. I'm not sure I can necessarily talk premise yet, but that's the next thing I'm working on.
So will you, do you see your niche as YA forever, or are you ever tempted to stray into adult type stuff?
No, I like to write an adult novel, and I think once I get past the two projects I'm working on now, the two I can't really talk about, I think I have a window of time where I could attempt an adult novel. Um, that would be a book nobody's asking for. It's not under contract. That would just be me trying. I think I would have a block of time where I could do that, and hopefully, it would be something that somebody would be interested in publishing.
Well, maybe that'll be like your ninth or 10th visit to Book Stew. That would be great. I
I'm
just
always
had,
happy to come back.
I have to bring up one thing because of where I live. There's a very key part of the book that involves the New England Patriots,
Yes.
and not in a good way, not in a particularly good way. So did you choose, why did you choose the Patriots? And I promise I'll protect you from any trolls that go after you.
Well, specifically, it was about that Super Bowl where Brady and James White had that really incredible comeback in the second half. And so, in the initial draft of the book, Cade's a wide receiver in the final version. In the initial draft, he was a running back. And
Oh,
so, the only reason I picked that particular game is because it was such a combination of Tom Brady and James White, who is a running back, having such an effect on the comeback. And so it felt appropriate at the time that Cade would be attracted to that game because of James White. Now, in the revision, he ended up becoming a receiver. And that was just, I don't know if there was any significant reason for the change. It just felt a little better considering how things go throughout the rest of the book. But it was no particular shade or loyalty to the Patriots. It that particular game is so famous, it worked out in terms of Cade's ambitions.
okay. All right. Then we won't take it personally.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Our time is running out. I read this book twice, and you know I'm the world's fastest reader, but the second, I'm not saying I didn't enjoy the first reading, but the second reading, it just deepened the book for me. And even though this is not my genre by any means, I can really, really recommend it as it's just propulsive. It just keeps going. You know, there's some quiet parts, and there's the sadness of, you know, losing a parent, having a parent who's very ill, but mostly it just keeps churning and churning ahead and churning ahead. And it is, to me, it's a true thriller and a great job as usual. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to hear.
All right, so Book Stew viewers and listeners, please, on my birthday or after, pick up Ruin Road with this very creepy cover. I would say that adults, of course, would like it. A lot of adults are reading YA these days because that seems to be where, what's being published. But in this case, you won't feel spoken down to in any way. You'll enjoy it just like your teenage children and friends will. So thanks again, Lamar, for being here again, and best of luck on everything coming up.
No, thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
All right. All right. We will see you all next time. Thanks, viewers and listeners.